happy to have on the Goldstein on Gelt show researcher Jenny Olson, who's done some fascinating research at the University of Michigan's Ross School of Business about an interesting side of business and how people date. So, Jenny, let me just open it up. You've looked at how people seem to prefer to date savers over spenders. What's this all about?
Yes, that's right. So we were really interested in kind of this phenomenon in evolutionary psychology that suggests that when we're trying to attract romantic partners, we tend to spend money in order to signal our resources and our value as a mate. But my advisor and colleague, Scott Rick, and I, we were thinking, but isn't this kind of potentially perceived as being wasteful? And so we started this project, and we were also more interested in kind of chronic general spending tendencies as opposed to just, specific instances of saving and spending in the form of like a Porsche or a luxury watch. And so, yeah, we created a series of experiments, and across them, we generally find that savers indeed are more attractive as romantic partners in the initial stages of relationship formation.
So this is not what people would generally expect, meaning guy goes out and buys a Porsche or an expensive watch. He expects that's going to be a babe magnet, right?
Exactly. I think there is this general intuition that spending money is used to attract mates. However, we were kind of interested in the opposite side of, how are those kind of splashy spending signals perceived by kind of the recipient of the target. And I think there is this general idea that people think that's attractive, but there is some initial studies that find that it works for men in short-term contexts, but we were also more interested in kind of the more enduring, longer-term relationships. And indeed, saving really is more desirable in the long run, especially.
Okay, so as a financial planner, I, of course, tell that to people all the time. My day job is that I'm an investment advisor and a financial planner, and I'm always evangelizing about the importance of savings. But you're saying, just to be clear, that if you're a young man looking to get a date, then the Porsche might help to make a short-term relationship, but won't necessarily help over the long term?
That's true. And interestingly, it might attract attention, but in our own kind of studies, we find that spending in the short term doesn't really have an advantage over saving. We find that people don't necessarily distinguish or kind of show preference for savers or spenders in the short term. So I think this belief that spending a lot of money early on will kind of convert into dates may not necessarily be the case. It surely, attracts attention, but it may not lead to kind of any kind of relationship.
Well, how can people really see that? Because you can see if I wear a fancy watch or a snazzy suit, but you don't really know how much money I have in my bank account.
Exactly. No, that's interesting that you ask. So we actually just ran an experiment looking at that, like if people are able to infer kind of general spending and saving habits just from, purely glancing at people, because as you rightly pointed out, it can be difficult to kind of sense someone's frugality, being short of kind of being a cheapskate, because that's also, the opposite end of being a saver. But we find that people indeed are better than chance at identifying savers and spenders. So what we did is we brought people into the lab and we had them, just kind of basically look at each other and without any kind of interaction or communication, and they just made guesses. And this was an incentivized experiment. We paid them $1 for every correct guess they got. And so they went around the room and indicated, whether or not they thought someone was generally more of a saver or a spender. And at the end of the experiment, we had people reveal to the group what their general tendencies were. And indeed, we found that people are better than chance at identifying. And they use cues like just physical appearance, demeanor, maybe just overall confidence in kind of, telling whether or not people generally are a saver and a spender. And we feel that, or our research also, it's not just about kind of the money you have in your bank account, but also the other positive qualities that saving conveys, things like self-control. So indeed, people are able to tell.
That's like the famous marshmallow experiment that they.
Exactly. People can tell. We're intuitive.
I got you. So you mentioned cheapskates. So it would seem to me that based on your studies, that if we take it to an extreme, then someone who's a cheapskate would be about as sexy as could be. No.
No. So our studies, we look at kind of saving and spending generally. I would argue that cheapskates kind of on the far end of the continuum of being a saver. I would argue that saving is something that people enjoy to do, and it's not kind of a painful thing. However, cheapskates, using that term, I would argue have kind of a different self-control problem. They're unable to overcome the urge not to spend. And so they find it painful to save because they know they should be spending more. It's similar to this tightwad spendthrift distinction. And so I would argue, again, that saving is something that people enjoy to do. It's more akin to frugality as opposed to being a cheapskate.
Mm-hmm. It does sound to me something you mentioned before, that it's not the question of whether a person has saved a lot of money, but rather, is he the type of person who saves, which would seem to suggest other character traits that savers would have.
Exactly. I think that saving conveys a lot of different benefits. And this general construct of self-control is really powerful because it's a general tendency to be able to inhibit impulses, and that can translate into being less likely to cheat, less likely to say hurtful things, and also just eat healthy. Because one of our studies was really interesting. We gave people an identical picture of someone and labeled them saver or spender, and people rated the saver as physically more attractive. So the ability to kind of, be able to eat healthy and exercise regularly, and the self-control also translate to physical attraction, which was really interesting.
That's amazing. We are talking with Jenny Olson, who's an expert in studying the way people spend and the way they save and the way they relate to one another. She's been talking to us about some of the research that they've done at the University of Michigan to determine or to show that people actually prefer to date someone who's a saver. So if you had to guess what it is that would make someone think that person looks better, what do you think that is?
So in terms of being a saver, like what looks better?
Your photograph experiment is really quite interesting. You said people saw, the subjects saw two photographs, and one was said to be a saver and one was a spender, and they seemed to find that the person who was a saver was better looking?
Right. Yeah. And it was interesting. I think because people kind of perceive that label of saver as thinking, it kind of triggers other associations in our mind, things like responsible, maybe cautious, again, that self-control aspect. And I think that kind of creates kind of a general, well, we kind of ruled this out, the halo effect, in terms of maybe savers are, perceived as more favorable in all dimensions, and physical attraction happens to be one of them. But no, unfortunately, savers do suffer from a lack of excitement. They're not.
That was my next question. So are they more boring? I mean, are savers just not as fun?
They are. So our experiments, we find that savers are overwhelmingly found to be less exciting than spenders. However, they're still rated as more attractive. So despite that, maybe perceived deficit in fun, they are still kind of generally more desirable as romantic partners.
So do you think that at different age groups, people would find that more fun? For example, in high school or college, someone doesn't care about a saver who is boring, even if stable, and would rather date the more fun, Porsche-owning fancy watch guy?
Yeah, and that's an interesting question too, because our studies, we focused on ages 18 to 35. So even this, young college population finds saving desirable. If anything, I would think that these tendencies would get stronger over time, as people head into retirement and maybe saving for their children's college funds. But it's fascinating that we find this preference even in 18-year-olds.
Mm-hmm. I was going to wonder if in second marriages, if you found this even more, because people were just desperate to find financial stability as part of their overall mating process.
Right, and that's a whole nother thing. We haven't looked into people kind of, that are already married and kind of, entering their second marriage. We actually have another project we're starting now. It's a field experiment where we're looking at people who are entering their first marriage and how they manage money in terms of joint accounts versus separate accounts, and kind of looking at, what, financial structure is more favorable for not only psychological well-being, but kind of marital happiness and economic well-being. But I would argue that, saving and spending tendencies, they probably become magnified as people enter marriage and then subsequent marriages. And then it gets more complicated with, his money, her money. We might have children from previous marriages, and that can really kind of, introduce more nuance into the equation. So it's a great question. And we'll hopefully explore that in future studies.
Aren't there studies that show that couples that have joint bank accounts are much, much more likely to succeed in their marriage than those who don't?
There is some correlational work in sociology that does suggest that people who have joint accounts tend to be happier, but it is correlational. We're not sure whether or not people that are already happy just tend to get joint accounts, or if joint accounts makes people happy. And so that's really why we're actually going to be doing an experiment looking at kind of what leads to greater success. So.
Mm-hmm. Now, I thought the experiment was something like, and again, I haven't seen it, but I thought that it was something to the effect of, if you look at couples who have joint accounts, then you can know that they are less likely to get divorced.
Right. Well, yeah, they tend to be happier. But again, we're not sure because they weren't randomly assigned to have joint accounts. They opened joint accounts on their own accord. So there might be something unique about the couples that open joint accounts that then make them happier because they already have these other pre-existing qualities. But if you randomly assign people to open joints versus separate accounts, you may be able to kind of disentangle the causal effects of, which one is kind of better for different people.
Uh-huh. Okay, so let's just wrap up with the topic we started with, which is savers and spenders. Do you think that a saver and a spender make a good match because opposites attract, or is that just a formula for failure?
That's an interesting question. There's a lot of debate around that. I'm not sure. I would say that for some people it does work because we tend to rely on our part. So for instance, a spender might rely on a saver to help them achieve self-control goals. And people that have higher self-control tend to be more accommodating for their partners. So I think that those pairings can be successful, just like the too high self-control. But the too low self-control, they may have a little more trouble. Because it might be fun and exciting in the beginning, but it could lead to, some trouble down the road.
Mm-hmm. All right, so we will have to watch and see. And listen, it would be great if we could follow your research. Jenny, what's the best way for people to keep track of what you're doing?
They can check out my website. It's jennyginolson.com. So Jenny, Ginolson.
Okay, we will put a link to that at the show notes at Goldstein on Gelt. Jenny Olson from the University of Michigan, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Doug's weekly radio show is heard around the world, but if you miss it, you can download the podcast at www.goldsteinongelt.com. The Goldstein on Gelt Show gives you up-to-date financial ideas so you can get on the path to financial freedom. If you'd like your questions answered on the air or off, send Doug an email to doug@profile-financial.com. It's your money for your future, so join Doug every week to build your wealth on the Goldstein on Gelt Show.